And we can start. So welcome everybody. So for our first webinar session today, AI Frontiers in Finance. So very happy to be back. Just some housekeeping stuff again. So we're going to record all of that today. So as usual, the session is going to appear on YouTube within a matter of days, I suppose. And they're going to share a link, of course, then also on our website and make everything available on there too, right? So before we get to our speakers, let me just briefly introduce the hosts here. So we are actually doing this here at Frankfurt School and hosting this from the Center for European Transformation. And we started that together with Paulina Verhoff, who is a PhD student here at Frankfurt School, and actually also something new. Last year she was visiting NYU, so now she's back. She's located here in Frankfurt again. And Birgit Frankenberg, who is founder and managing director of High Peak business consultancy company here also in Frankfurt, and who's also advising the center in various things also what we're doing. So the reason why we actually got interested in this topic is because people were sort of like working both in research but also in the industry on AI topics, and it's basically everywhere everybody is talking about, but everybody sort of like apparently has very similar, not necessarily similar goals, but similar ideas. So I thought we thought it might make sense to actually bring them all together in order to see sort of what are actually interesting use cases to work on, what are the newest applications, how can this be used, and how is this done differently on the academic vis-a-vis industry side. But then we saw also that basically a lot of people actually working in the industry are actually also academics. So this is also applies to our discussion today as well, as you will see. So what you can do here, so we're going to have we're going to do a poll in a couple of minutes to get you involved. But then during the sort of like discussion, you can start asking questions, right? So what you can do is if you have a technical problem, you can use the chat and then we get immediately back to you. But for all other things, please use the Q&A function, right? And for those who have actually been here in the last couple of sessions as well, you can actually do thumbs up. And if you find a question interesting, then it actually moves up the ladder and we can start asking those during the discussion. So let us immediately go and see that was my mistake, speakers for today. So we're very happy here to have Marina Niessner from Indiana. Marina has a PhD from the University of Chicago. She was in Yale before, also was involved with AQR, a quantitative hedge fund, I believe, before she moved to Indiana University. And then we have Christos on the other hand, who actually is really, as I said, he's sort of a little bit between both worlds. He's an associate professor at Carey Business School in Arizona, but then he's also he's a PhD from Stanford and various affiliation with business schools and also with the industry companies in his profession. I think he can talk much better about himself, what he's actually doing there. And today, Marina is going to present some work that she's been doing on AI personality extraction from faces, labor market implication. And that is this time actually a paper that I would have liked to write myself, but there's no need anymore. So I'm very much looking forward to see how you guys actually discuss that and what the outcome of all of that is. Before I hand over to you both, let me briefly do the poll, right? So we thought about a question, and let me put this on to see what other people think. So here it is. So AI-based personality extraction from facial images is being explored as a predictor of labor market outcomes. What do you think is the most critical concern regarding its adoption in hiring and screening processes? Accuracy and bias, or ethical and privacy issues, predictive power, or is this adoption risk? So give a couple of seconds that everybody has a chance to participate, and then let's see what our presenters and discussants say about the outcome. So let's give a few more seconds until we close that. I think everybody can. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's close it. And I think that should be fine. So these are the results. Yeah. So now apparently 44% say it's accuracy and bias, followed by predictive power, followed by ethical and privacy issues. So over to you, Marina, Christos. Is this something that you would have expected, that people would say that, or would you have a different opinion?
Sort of expected. I've heard comments also before about the ethical sort of privacy issues, which I think something the regulators are concerned with as well. But definitely unbiased kind of falls under that as well.
Yeah, no, I think that lines up a lot with the policy dialogue around how to build these trustworthy AI systems and manage that risk. It's maybe we'll get into this more in the talk as well, but it was interesting because the AI summit that was going on in Paris, I was just listening to a couple of the different speakers, and with a lot of the rhetoric around the challenges, we sometimes overlook some of the opportunities. And so I was really interested in Vice President Vance's comments about let's focus on the opportunities, but also manage the risks. So anyways, it does line up, but without further ado, I'll turn it back to you, Sasha.
Perfect. Awesome. So I'm going to close this one. And now I'm handing it over to you guys. Marina, you're going to start. Very much looking forward to what you have to present. Thank you guys for being here.
Okay, perfect. Let me share this. Did I set this up correctly? And then can you guys see this? Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is joint work with Marius Günzel at Wharton, Shimon Kogan at Reichman at Wharton, and Kelley at Yale. So before I start, I want to give people a little bit of background on this topic, sort of to the extent, sorry, I'm making sure this is not blocking me. To the extent that it's being used already and what is being done in the private sector. Oops. So first of all, personality has been used as screening mechanism in the labor market for quite a while. So here are just some examples. So Yale SOM uses it as part of their admission process. So do several other top business schools. Here's a snippet from an article in the Wall Street Journal from 2015 saying that today's personality test raised the bar for job seekers. And that's something companies have been doing for quite a while. And obviously, more recently, AI has also entered the labor market screening kind of process. So here was an article from Top AI Recruiting Tools and Software of 2025. And here's a specific company that I want to highlight where Find My Fit helps candidates identify roles that best match their potential by quickly assessing their skills, interests, and personality. And then at the bottom, and that's something that we briefly talked about, your next job interview may be with Alex, the AI interviewer. So now they're even using AI sort of to conduct interviews instead of an actual human being. And just generally, recruiting is extremely costly for companies. And so AI has been getting involved in every level to screening, shortlisting, selection. We just start conducting interviews, doing predictive analysis and personality matching, resume screening, et cetera. So if you just look up in the news, AI and hiring, there'll be a million articles that you can look at. More related to our paper, so some companies, especially HireVue, my understanding that's one of the biggest US-based sort of AI hiring help companies, they, around 2018, they said that they offer video-based algorithmic assessments, which provide excellent insight into attributes like social intelligence, communication skill, personality traits, and overall job aptitude. So they sort of came out and said they're going to use videos to extract personality traits. It was a complete black box and it creeped people out. So there was a lot of pushback against it. And they sort of stopped it, but my understanding is, and we saw other companies advertise extracting personality, they just sort of don't say how they do that. So I think they came out kind of explaining it and there was pushback and some of it just sort of went underground a little bit. Internationally, there are companies that are upfront about using video assessment to do personality. So this is, my understanding, is a very large international sort of, again, hiring help company, Elevatus, and they have, at least on their website, they have lots of large clients, including US-based clients, and they say video assessment interviews how successfully gauge a candidate, gauge, sorry, candidate's personality. Our video interviewing software helps you find the perfect match between applicant and role through a 5-factor model. We spend a lot of time trying to find on their website exactly how they do that. They're not very transparent about it, but they definitely say they use video assessment to extract personalities. And as Christos sort of mentioned already, there's been a lot of regulatory discussions about it. I am not an expert or a lawyer, but from my understanding, there was the American Privacy Rights Act, which was supposed to partially address AI in hiring, and that failed last summer. So at this point, we have sort of a patchwork of various regulations across states. So 4 states currently, as far as I could find, have some regulation sort of addressing AI in hiring: Illinois, Maryland, New York, and Colorado. A bunch of states are kind of thinking about it, about to come out with it. And then obviously we have the EU Artificial Intelligence Act from last year that sort of addresses some of these concerns. But the point is, the regulators are at a point where still trying to decide on this. And as Christos mentioned, and I definitely agree with that, there are some pluses and minuses of using AI in hiring. There's definitely efficiency gains, but we have to balance that against other concerns. And we do have a disclaimer for our paper. We assess the photo-big 5 predictive power. This is not advocating for usage in the labor market screening. And again, I'm not a lawyer or an ethics expert, but from our understanding, this falls under fundamental statistical discrimination. So you're making inferences from immutable characteristics. And so outside of race, gender, and other issues, even when you look within the same race and gender, you might think that, for example, it prevents you from improving your personality. From research, I think changing your personality is not easy, but it is possible. And we don't have enough research right now to address whether that actually changes your face, for example, and the way you act. So I think partially more research is needed, but also, again, we're definitely not advocating for usage as of now in the labor markets. Okay, with that disclaimer, I'm going to talk about our paper. So there's also academic motivation and definitely a strong academic interest in this. We know that human capital, sort of cognitive and non-cognitive abilities, are crucial in labor market success, but also many other areas. So there's actually been a lot of research on personality in various sort of labor market, education, health, crime outcomes, et cetera. And James Heckman, who is a Nobel Prize winner at Chicago, has done a lot of research on personality and labor markets and education. So far, personality has been mostly measured from surveys. And that is obviously limits the sample size a lot. It makes it hard to compare across papers because they might be using different surveys, et cetera. So one contribution we're hoping to make with this paper, if this method works, then we'll be able to measure personality at a large scale. So we will be able to observe not only personality, but also other observable characteristics for lots and lots of people, which I think will help us to make progress in a lot of these academic fields that study how personality affects various life outcomes. There's also now AI facial recognition has entered sort of mainstream. So there's been some academic research trying to use faces. Apparently people also have been trying to use it for dating. And in particular, in the middle, there's a paper that came out in Quarterly Journal of Economics recently, where they found that when you look at the judge's decision whether to incarcerate individuals while they await trial, controlling for race and gender, they're just pixels in their face predict up to 50% of the judge's decision. And they do other things in their paper. It's more about hypothesis generation, but it's still not even 100% clear from their paper how much it describes behavior, how much they're capturing just judges' biases, et cetera. So this is what, so we're building on top of sort of some existing literature and some in a setting where the private sector is already using this. So what do we do in our paper? We apply AI photo, basically personality analysis to LinkedIn data sets. We're focusing on MBAs. not because we think they're the most people worthy of studying, but we needed to limit our sample somehow. And also industry participants argue that this is an area where soft skills are especially important. And we also know that survey and task-based personality measures are already heavily used in that space. And we evaluate the predictive power of what we call photo Big Five for labor market outcomes. And I will introduce these Big Five traits in 1 second. Just to preview our results, we do find significant predictive power for school ranks, compensation, job seniority, and job transitions. And just to give you an estimate of the size, so going from, for example, for compensation, from the least desirable personality to the most desirable, meaning that personality with the most compensation and personality types with the least compensation based on analysis, is a big, depending on gender, is a little smaller or a little bigger than the black-white compensation gap, which we know is quite large in the US. We'll also find that it correlates with some survey-based measures, and it has incremental predictive power to GPAs and test scores, which is important because there's obviously concern with, for example, picking up intelligence or other cognitive skills. So let me introduce the methodology and data. So the Big Five personality traits, they were developed in psychology, and my understanding is there are several ways to measure personality, but this is one of the more commonly used ones, and definitely within economics. So the Big Five factors: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, the ocean factors. Obviously, our personalities are very multifaceted. And as you can see, each of those characteristics, they capture other facets. So we often think of extroversion as just, oh, sociable, but it actually captures sociability, assertiveness, energy levels, et cetera. So these are pretty wide groups. The method we're using right now is from a paper that was published in Nature Scientific Reports in 2020, where the authors basically got about 13,000 volunteers to submit their photos, and they took also a Big Five personality survey. They actually had more participants than these, but these are photos that were neutral expression and sort of they were able, not celebrities, et cetera. They extracted facial features, and I'm not a machine learning expert, but basically they put the Big Five on the left-hand side and facial features on the right-hand side, and they wrote a machine learning algorithm to predict them. And they were trained separately for male and female faces for various reasons, so we'll present our results separately for men and women. Is this complete pseudoscience? Is this just absolutely crazy? So there are reasons to believe that personality and faces may be related. So, and these are non-exclusive reasons, and we don't actually have proof for it. It's just sort of reasons that there might be a connection. So first of all, there could be a genetic connection. We definitely know faces will look often like our parents, so they're partially at least genetic. Now there's more and more research that personality is at least partially determined by genetics. The most recent paper by Gupta et al. In Nature, Yale School of Medicine sort of wrote up that paper. Apparently we've known for quite a while that neuroticism is connected to genetics, and now they have linked the other 4 of the Big Five personality characteristics to sort of genes. There's no evidence right now that these genes are the same, that the facial genes or are related, but this is, my understanding is still a very open area of research. There could also be non-genetic connections. So we know that the pre and postnatal hormones affect both face and personality. And there may be complete non-genetic relationship where if you have certain facial features when you're young, people might be treating you a certain way. And we know your personality is formed when you're young. And so there might be this way a relationship between facial features and your personality that doesn't have anything to do with genetics. Again, these are non-mutually exclusive reasons, and there's not really a lot of evidence right now, even to show that this particular reason works, even though, again, this is a very open area of research, and I'm hoping we'll have more evidence at some point. Let me give you some visual evidence that there might be something to a relationship between our faces and our personality. So this is from the original Nature paper. And what the authors did, they had the people take surveys, and they sorted individuals based on their survey responses into different buckets. So if you, based on your survey, were very extroverted, you went into one bucket, and if you were very introverted, you went in another bucket. And then they used software to morph the photos of the people in those buckets. And so here are for extroversion neuroticism, and they have all 5 in their paper. So low extroversion, high extroversion, low neuroticism, high neuroticism. These look a little bit creepy because these are more photos of a lot of people. But we can see with our eyes that there are some differences between them. They have slightly different noses, and again, it's hard for us necessarily put it in words what the differences are. But there's some visual differences, and these are exactly the things that computers are very good at picking up. The last thing I want to talk about, I mentioned about the methodology. We did play around with their method. So we have access to an API where we send photos, and they provide us with a Big 5 personality score. So they're absolutely not affected by your clothes. That's not part of it. Not your hair. Makeup doesn't seem to matter much. It has to be a good resolution, but not great, fairly small resolution works. We also played around a lot with facial expressions, and obviously we've got a lot of questions around this. This is my co-author and I, so we put our own photos through. I also got a hold of a sample, and we have a much larger sample than is shown here, from a psychology study of individuals with different facial expressions, smiling, non-smiling. And the variance across people is much, much, much larger than the variance within people. So this algorithm is relatively stable to whether you're smiling or not. So that doesn't affect so it focuses on much, much smaller features than that. So how accurate is this algorithm? So out of sample within their data, the correlation between self-reported and predicted scores between 0.14 for openness for women and 0.36 conscientiousness for men. And obviously there are 10 of them, 5 for women, 5 for men. 7 out of 10 are greater than 0.2. How does this compare? So let me give you a benchmark. So from this paper, they asked people's peers, so coworkers and friends, to assess your personality and compared it to your self-reported personality, and the correlations were between 0.3 and 0.4. And these are people who knew you well. And then if they asked strangers to assess your personality after a short interaction, so like let's say an interview, the correlations were much lower. So it's from 0 basically to 0.29. So a machine does a little bit better than just a person who doesn't know you very well. Also, this is from a paper by James Heckman, correlations between behavioral task measures of personality and questionnaire measures of personality seldom exceed 0.3. And just a reminder, the true personality is latent, right? Your own assessment of your personality may and is very likely biased, or our own assessment. And so in the end, we're trying to get at some latent measure, which is someone's true personality. So let me describe the data we're using. So we have 2 data sets right now. One is a large-scale data set of education and employment history from LinkedIn, and we have their photos, and this comes from Revelio Labs, which is a very common source of LinkedIn data for academics at this moment. We also have a smaller data set, and I'll show you it's growing, of several top 10 US MBA programs, entrance screening, and academic performance, where we can observe their photos and also their academic performance, GPA, and test scores. We also follow a lot of prior literatures, and we include in our regression a lot of controls for photos. So we have photo age and race, attractiveness scores, how blurry the photo is, whether they have glasses, emotional expression, probability of Photoshop, et cetera. So we build on prior literature and sort of control for all these things in our analysis. Let me tell you about our large-scale results, and then I'll show you the small sample results. So in the end, we focus, as I mentioned, on MBA students from top 10 programs who graduated between 2000 and 2023. And our final sample has 70,000 men and 26,000 women. And we're required that their first job is in the US to make sure compensation is comparable. So here's our first set of results. So first, we look just at school rank. So as I said, we do separate men and women for our analysis. So here, 1 is the highest school rank, and we find that agreeableness has a different effect for men and women. Conscientiousness has a strong positive effect, extroversion, a strong negative effect, and neuroticism and openness is a bit mixed. And this is actually fairly consistent, the sign of these coefficients, with prior literature on post-secondary education and standardized tests. So we kind of look at prior literature a bit as a sanity check for our measure. How big are these effects? So basically, and I'll be referring to this measure quite a bit throughout the talk, this is, as I mentioned, going from the bottom quintile to the top quintile of personality. So look at the personality in the top quintile of school ranking relative to the bottom quintile. How much rank does that get you? So for men, it's about 2.6 ranking spots, and for women, 6.5. The average ranking is about 35 in our sample. And so this is, especially for women, this is a 17% increase. So that's given how much people spend, how much time and energy and money on trying to get into a better MBA program. This is quite a significant effect. We also do the same for compensation. So here we have also, we have race controls in both, but I want to here show the race controls because we're going to use that as a benchmark. And again, we include image controls, et cetera, here. And we find that for men, so first, we don't have full fixed effects, and conscientiousness and extroversion have have very high effects, and openness sort of smaller and negative. When we include school fixed effects, so controlling for which school they went to, even though we do know that which school they go to is a bit affected by personality as well, conscientiousness is less significant because we saw it helps you get into schools, and extroversion still matters. And for women, we generally find similar results, even though there are a couple small differences, neuroticism and agreeableness. Again, how big are these effects? So if you focus on columns 2 and 4, going from sort of the bottom quintile to the top quintile is about 4% for men and 4.7% for women. If we focus on the black-white compensation gap, so the white category is the emitted category here, we see that the gap, depending on which gender you look at, is a little bit smaller or larger than the black-white compensation gap, which is, again, quite significant in the US and something that's been studied a lot. It's also actually, the results are quite stable if we control for O-net job classifications. So what that means is that these effects aren't just driven by people selecting into different industries or different professions. This is controlling for their job classification. We still see these differences across personalities. I'm going to briefly, just to be on time, show you how it compares to prior studies. So again, we compared compensation to prior literature. These are the effects we just found in the table that I showed you. It's hard to compare effects, the size across papers, because people measure things differently. So here we normalize the highest coefficient to just be 1. We're mostly comparing the signs and relative effect size. And when we look at prior papers, so there's one paper that looked at job productivity, we find similar-ish effects. Now, of course, it's not perfectly the same, so we can see agreeableness seems to go the other way in the prior study. But once we look at conscientiousness and extroversion, which seem to be the two big fives that have the most effect based on prior literature, we find that these matter in our study as well. We also find, I'm going to go through this a little quicker. We also find similar effect on growth. So your compensation growth between your first year and your 5th year, even though the effects are smaller. So now we only have a 2% and a 2.4% increase. But if you look, the effects of race and other characteristics like attractiveness also go down. So it looks like those things really matter for your first job when you get hired. And there's a decrease effect for your kind of project for your growth. And we find generally similar results for seniority as well, if we look at seniority rather than compensation. Obviously, those are related. For job mobility, this is something that companies spend a lot of time worrying about because turnover is extremely costly for companies. We find that agreeableness has positive effects for how long you stay at your company and negative for how many companies and industries you go on to later. Conscientiousness, interestingly, has a positive effect for tenure, so you stay longer at the position, but conditional on leaving, you actually go more often to a different industry. Extroversion has a negative effect on tenure, so you're less likely to stay in your position. and it has which maybe talk to people, and it has a positive effect on how many firms and industries you end up in. Neuroticism has also a negative effect on tenure, but actually conditional on going somewhere else, you're less likely to enter a different industry and more likely to stay in your own industry. And then openness has positive for tenure and negative for number of firms, etc. Women have very similar results for the Sheehan characteristics, and then for openness, it's negative. It's slightly different than for men. But we saw that actually for several analyses that openness seems to go sort of the other way for women and men. The last thing we'll look at, and this is very much work in progress, is as I mentioned, we have a small data set from top MBA programs in the US. So we have admission data, their photo directories, which we may match to LinkedIn profiles. So we right now have 1,300 observations. Again, we're building it out. We have 1,100 LinkedIn profiles that we're able to match. And we have 273 individuals for who we have their MBA photo, so when they entered the MBA program, and also their LinkedIn photo, which according to our algorithms on average was taken about 10 years later. So one interesting result that we find is that and we have this for all Big Five in our paper, that the results are fairly similar for the two types of photos. Again, it's a small sample, but there's a strong correlation between agreeableness, et cetera, measures from the photo when you entered the MBA program and your LinkedIn photo. One is black and white, the other one is color, and they're about 10 years apart. So these characteristics that we extract seem to be fairly stable over age. Also, we have a very small sample where we have actually survey results from the entrance or MBA admission process. And we find that the average correlation is about 0.16 to 0.18 from men and women between, again, this is fully out of sample now, between these survey responses and the photo Big Five, even though the survey wasn't even exactly a Big Five, so we had to do some matching into facets. So this is pretty good out of sample test. And the last thing I want to show here before I conclude, and again, this is a small sample, so we're still building them out. We're having some power issues here, but we do find that once we control for their GPA, GMAT scores, and MBA GPA, the results for the Big Five on compensations do not change much. So the coefficients are quite stable. So this suggests that we're not picking up necessarily intelligence or cognitive skills, that these are truly the soft skills that we're picking up. And again, this is still work in progress. So just to conclude, as I mentioned, we explore a new methodology that I think is not necessarily new to the private sector, but I think new to academics, to try to understand, is there any predictive power within Big Five personalities extracted from photos on labor market outcomes? Currently, we find that there's pretty strong predictive power, even remains after controlling for a bunch of demographic and characteristics. But again, this is just first project. I think we need a lot more work in this space to have much more sort of conclusive results here. So thank you very much. I look forward to comments, questions, etc.
That was awesome. Thank you, Marina. Now, Christos, over to you. So what are you saying about this?
Should I stop sharing? Or
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, you can, I mean, you're welcome to keep it up if you want.
There we go.
But no, this is great. Well, thank you again, Sasha and Paulina. This is really incredible, the series that you've put together, and thank you for doing this. I'm one of the two things that I'm really impressed by is, number one, bringing together such a wide audience of people, and that's not easy to do because everybody comes from sometimes different methodologies, different empirical backgrounds, and so on. And then second, the fact that you're able to bring together people from US, Europe, and that's something that I personally am eager to see more of, and one of the reasons I love spending time in Europe as well. It's not just for the Topfingalatsche overall, it's also for the great academic work. So I love this paper by Marina and co-authors. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to discuss it. I'm going to start with two meta thoughts and then three kind of practical, empirical suggestions. The first is just around this whole literature around trustworthy AI, and the United States and many European countries have been engaged on what are the principles that we should be using to identify whether or not an AI model, system, is ethical, and that's possibly a philosophical question as well, because what axioms do we as individuals agree on? And generally there's a decent amount of consensus. I'd say things like transparency, accessibility, understandability are fairly agreed upon. When you get to principles around fairness, then you've got many different definitions in the statistical learning literature around like what is fair. Does it mean demographic parity? Does it mean equalized odds? And for those that are interested, I have a write-up on different approaches to it, and happy to drop that in the chat later. So number one is just around how do we understand the axiomatic principles by which people develop trust around AI systems, much like we trust individuals. Even if somebody makes a decision that we disagree with, if we understand the logic and the process by which it was followed, we might still respect that decision. And so I think the big question for AI systems is around how do we inculcate trust, because if things are just happening as a black box, then that will alienate people, alienate organizations, and end up reducing turnover. Even if in the short run it maybe has positive effects, it could damage medium and long run. The second meta question, and again, before I get into any of the details empirically, is around this constant debate between prediction and causation. And so one of the questions that often comes up in industry is, when do we need a causal model to understand the phenomenon at play, versus when can we just build a predictive model that seems to be doing a decent job? And a lot of times I think the answer comes down to, are we trying to make short run decisions where the boat is moving in a direction that we generally agree on, and we're just trying to predict something that is more short run in nature? Or is there a categorical, qualitative, important medium and long run decision that needs to be made? So for example, if an organization is trying to decide what types of people are best for our organization, maybe because they never had a good answer to that for 10 years, or maybe they're making a pivot in the organizational strategy, that's where having a causal model really matters. And I think many times it's easy to just build a predictive model that does well, and then you say, hey, this does well, we should keep doing this, but we don't often grapple with the very important strategic questions as an organization. So two meta comments, and now the kind of more empirical comments. So one of the things that I was really, I mean, this paper, I mean, Marina, fantastic job, and your co-authors have done a lot of work. I hope it's already in review and going through the refereeing process. So none of my comments are things that I think are remote deal breakers or any sort of negative things. It's just areas maybe to look more at. One of the last diagnostics that you presented was about the persistence of these big five characteristics. And in the psychology literature, there is kind of this recognition that these are immutable characteristics. They're not like, if you resurvey people or you take many different images of somebody, you're not going to be getting fundamentally different scores of agreeableness or neuroticism, et cetera. But I do wonder if an individual, as they mature, will naturally sometimes fork, where somebody starts off really shy, and then there's a life experience that catapults them onto a different trajectory. And so that would be, to the extent that there can be panel data on images, that would be really interesting to explore. But again, I know it's kind of outside the scope of this paper. The second comment, and I think this one is more actionable and maybe even more interesting, because it'll allow you to help test the mechanism. And let me actually put this link in the chat. I don't know if we had already discussed it, but one of my papers is skills. Here we go. So one of the papers that I have going on, because for those that are, everybody that's listening, it's a hilarious experience. Back in, I think, 2018, I was at this gala and sat next to Angela Duckworth, and I remembered reading her or watching her TEDx talk that she gave. I don't know, it was like 2013 or something. It was years before that. And I was always wondering, like, there is this very rich personality and psychology literature around grit, around persistence, et cetera, that exists for early childhood. market? Can we take that into the labor market and understand the labor market returns to personality? And so that ended up leading to this paper that I wrote with her and one of her postdocs at the time, Lewis Hickman. And so this paper introduces a measure from ONET. So for every occupation, there is these measures of what are called occupational personality requirements. They measure the degree to which different occupations require more extroversion versus introversion, et cetera. And so there's 16 of these. And so we did PCA and we condensed it into two clusters. We called one intellectual tenacity and the other social adjustment. We matched that to the American Community Survey between 2006 and 2019. And then we estimated earnings regressions, basically trying to recover the returns to tenacity and social adjustment. And we control for cognitive skills. So similar to what you do, we're trying to understand, is there oh, yeah, thank you, Paulina. Yeah, I realized mine just went to hosts and panelists. So what we were trying to rule out is like that there is a personality effect on earnings. Now, why is this relevant for your paper? Besides generally being in the orbit of adjacent literature, one thing you might be able to do, because you have the SOC codes and the Revelio data is great, and I encourage other people to look into using it as well, is using our intellectual tenacity and social adjustment, or maybe even all 16 personality traits. You can estimate whether or not there are complementarities between, because what you're getting is individual personality. What we get is occupational. So we wish that we had individual, and maybe there is and so you can look for, are people that are more agreeable, do they tend to do better in certain types of occupations? And so that might provide a mechanism by which you can test productivity effects versus a sorting selection sort of effect. The third comment, and maybe I have 4 comments, so maybe I lied. Maybe there's 3 or 4. So third is like a small thing to do, I think, is just around using coarsened exact matching on like race, age, and gender, and just being a little bit more non-parametric about like how tightly you're controlling for different factors and seeing that. So I mean, that's like a 5-minute thing, and it'll tell you yes or no. And then I was wondering if there's also a way to match with GitHub data for the subsample, because getting these productivity proxies is hard, and you do get at this a little bit and the different subsets of the data. But I do wonder if there was a way to look at public profiles. And again, it's MBA students, so how many people are going to actually have GitHub repositories? It might be too thin of a sample to actually do anything on, but I was just thinking about publicly available data where you could measure like actual productivity. And then at the end, when you benchmark it to other estimates that are out there. But yeah, maybe that's a different paper. Maybe it's not this one. So I think that is all the kind of practical, small empirical thoughts that I had. But just to kind of land the plane, I think it's extremely important to be thinking about. Well, 2 things I really love about this paper is, number one, it's taking off the shelf, state-of-the-art ML techniques, applying it to economics and finance. That's great, and it's always interesting to see that. And then number 2, it's asking this fundamental question of how do organizations actually select people that are the right fits? Because so many organizations have needless friction, because they're just hiring the wrong fit, and somebody realizes, oh wow, this is like a lot more extroverted of a place than I signed up for. And so I think the conversation around it's not just about like getting an alpha, getting a extra predictive power. It's about how do we minimize search frictions. If we could remove search frictions and get to like a RBC model where there's just like perfectly competitive markets, we would have a lot less distortions in the world. And so I think as long as employees and employers come to the middle and say like, we both, like, employees want the search frictions to be smaller, employers want the search costs to be frictions to be smaller. How do we come to some sort of middle ground so that everybody wins and gets to a better fit employee and employer? So let me stop there, and I guess we can open up for general Q&A, or Sasha, take it from here.
Can I add to that? Because I've basically exactly the last point. I thought that also at the beginning of your presentation, Marina, you thought a little bit of, it goes both ways, right? On the one hand, the employer has better predictability in what's actually a good guy to hire, but also to what extent would this help the person? Okay, what is actually a good company? What's actually a good fit for me? Here in this case, of course, based on, I don't know based on what characteristics. So it's even based on so what kind of preferences I have. So this would be one question that I had. The other one, coming from very simplistic, maybe from the banking literature and also credit literature, right? So the result that you have, that sort of like the first job more or less predictive power very high, and then a couple of things changes if you go basically for second, third, fourth job and so on. Isn't that sort of consistent with the idea that that kind of technology makes sense if there's high information symmetry, there's not very clear who I want to hire, then at some point, sort of like the results and what he's accomplished speaks for him or herself, and then people just basically hire based on other attributes, basically, right? Does it make sense? And that's basically, is this then kind of also related to in some industries, for some jobs, it's actually better to use, but in others, it's actually not really necessary because sort of the kind of criteria might change and might be very much different as to who I would like to hire. But now over to you, Marina, and lots of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much, Christos. These are fantastic comments. I definitely agree, kind of bigger picture, there need to be debates about transparency and fairness. And it's definitely a large discussion that we're just contributing a little bit to. Thank you so much for the ONET paper. This is actually fantastic because we're trying to do this analysis, but we've mostly been survival, like, oh, like sales looks like extroverted people should be there. So having some sort of exogenous setup is going to be super helpful. The GitHub data, it's definitely something we're thinking about. I should clarify, we have 600 million photos. We're focusing on MBA students, but we have photos for almost all of LinkedIn that are publicly available, not to creep people out. But so we can definitely—
a personalized prediction for each of us on the call and tell us how we rank.
Exactly. And kind of related to also what Sasha asked, I'm sure different job types where some of these things matter more or less. Again, MBAs are, my understanding is, are especially where personality and these things I think employers really focus on, and some others there might be less, like in some more blue collar work, etc. So we're definitely would love in the follow-up paper also to examine kind of the sample beyond MBA. And I agree. Also, it might be, we often think about it from the side of the companies, but also as individuals, we obviously want to have a good fit at the job that we're at, because moving is not just costly for companies, but it's very costly for individuals. So it may be a more positive way to present it, that it might also help individuals selecting into companies. So thank you very much. Lots of things to think about here.
Yeah, no, I mean, my pleasure. And one more small comment just on the end there is that a lot of times you see individuals trying to manipulate, like once an AI, and I don't like to use the word AI all the time because it's like such a loaded term, but like, let's just say once a machine learning algorithm is out there that displays a certain level of predictive power, people find ways to manipulate around it. So it wouldn't be surprising if, like, in even just like 6 months, people start figuring out ways to touch up their photos. And you already like work to filter this a little bit, but it's just like, if once we think that we've arrived at like a new benchmark, then people look to counter it. And so it's just always this cat and mouse sort of game that goes on. And so it's tricky.
No, for sure. And that's why I think some companies don't disclose their, the algorithm, et cetera. No, and I think we have a question here from a surgeon, and we've heard that before for sure. Like getting plastic surgery, I don't know anybody who does it, but there are definitely a lot of people who do, and that's like the extreme version of Photoshop. And so, no, it's definitely a concern. And again, and there might be some argument to keep some of these methods, like not just put the algorithm online so people can game it. But also one concern that I know employers have, and that's why they partially moved to this, people can also game surveys. So if you look at the big survey companies that help employers hire people with these personality surveys, if you go to YouTube, there are walkthroughs for all these tests, how to answer the personality survey, right? And it's clear when you're answering the survey, like, are you hardworking? Like, do you like other people? You know what you should be saying. But that's always an issue, this kind of cat and mouse kind of problem for sure.
So one thought that I had is that, I mean, now it's AI and there's a lot of discussion about this, but kind of like more simpler, like machine learning approaches have been used in various settings for a long period of time, right? And coming back for just basically the simple credit risk discrimination in terms of who's going to default and who not. And people were developing, or banks were developing, scorecards as to including, of course, like age and occupation and a lot of these different things. And of course, also they help to, and also where you live, right? Which is also very disputed issue, specifically here in Germany, right? And based on these, we're relatively able to predict at least, so what is sort of the likelihood that this guy is to default, and then at least to maybe even support that kind of algorithm and automatic response. They're usually sort of like overrides by people. And apparently that helped to overcome the fear that there's too much sort of like discrimination against one side or the other. To what extent are these kind of mechanisms applicable in an AI sense, right? So what are, since you both discussed also in the sort of what are the higher order question, how you can get trust into these technologies, are there any possible ways to actually do that, right? In Europe, we're relatively fast in saying, okay, we need an AI, we need an act to actually to avoid all of that, right? So in order to not innovate at all. But what are possible ways to actually allow that to happen, but put some safeguards into place here? Are there any suggestions from your end?
Marina, do you want to?
I mean, my understanding is, and again, I'm not a machine learning expert, while machine learning can be a black box, there are ways to test its sort of biases, whether, and a bit to get at its decision process, something that we're working on kind of also in this paper, we're not there yet. One thing I do want to point out, and I recently presented this in front of a bunch of lawyers, we discussed the law and ethic part of it. We often don't actually have transparency with human decisions either, right? So one requirement people put on AI, if you reject someone, the person should be able to ask, why was I rejected by this AI? But you get rejected by a human and they, like, that's it. So I think there's also something about this algorithm aversion that we put a much higher bar on AI. But on the other hand, like the positive spin on that is that some of this actually allows to have data that we can analyze for kind of your question to, for biases, et cetera, whereas with humans, we really don't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point because when we get a desk reject from QJE, it doesn't always come with a explanation. And so if we can have more scalable solutions using machine learning where we can do things like feature importance, you can understand how much different features contribute to the overall outcome, that's helpful. I think where it's the danger and why the human in the loop buzzword I think is a useful buzzword is that the potential ramifications are much more they can grow really fast, so let's say something was automated at scale, then whereas humans would have created frictions in that process before something could become really bad, now it's all of a sudden it becomes really bad really fast and you can't stop it. So that's where like human in the loop makes a big difference. But ultimately, I think this just comes back to we don't own our own data. So as individuals, when we put out content, whether it be on LinkedIn or whether it be publish an article, we don't really own our own data. And so then companies are able to suck up that data and build models, do whatever, whether it's training a new version of ChatGPT or something else. And until we solve that data ownership problem, I think it's going to be hard to create the right incentives that have like liability for when companies misuse it. So this maybe goes a little bit outside of scope for the discussion today, but it's something I've been thinking about. It's just like, how do you align incentives? And what I'll just wrap up my one thought here is that I think the discussion around blockchain and AI are sometimes in different happening in different islands. But my view is that the two are kind of the two sides of the same coin, where blockchain is about cryptography and securing networks, and then AI is about how do you process large amounts of data. And if we thought about ways of well, sorry, now I'm kind of blabbering a little bit, so I'll be super quick. And if anyone's curious, I can put this paper in the chat too. But what if every piece of data that we had, like every article that we publish, anything that we write online, there was like an NFT version of that exists on the blockchain. Then anytime an LLM were to suck that up or a machine learning model were to suck that up, it would be cryptographically linked with that metadata. And so if it turns out that that piece of data is valuable for the weights that go into training the underlying model, then you could remunerate the underlying content creators proportionally based off of the ex post value that it creates in the model. So all that to say is like, I think this raises so many questions. And I mean, I think that until we figure out data ownership, it's going to be hard to fully solve this issue. Sasha.
Yeah, but if you're basically that far that you're saying, okay, look, this piece of information is clearly attributable to that person, would you go that far and say, look, before I actually use it, I need to ask for permission, or is everybody who is putting this information online then basically makes it usable, but then he gets some sort of loyalties or royalties or something based on how it's being used?
Yeah, it's that fair use doctrine. And I mean, this is one area where like Europe has been, I mean, I know that there's different views about this, but I mean the precaution around like GDPR and what you consent to. Now, the challenge with that is that I mean, sometimes to visit a certain website, you basically have to accept. And so it's you don't really have an option. But yeah, I think that if there was more liability, companies would be much more judicious about how they use the data. And if they do something negative, like if they do use images to do something that is linked with bad outcomes, there's more of a penalty for them. Versus now, I mean, they can just be like, oh, well, here and there, and it's like very wishy-washy. So I think it's fundamentally about creating stronger incentives through liability protection of individuals. Anyways, that takes a little bit outside of scope, so I apologize for that.
I think related, I'm hoping our paper and some of this research will also alert people to what someone can do with their photo, right? This is developing very fast. And at some point, like right now, I think the only concern with putting things on social media is like, oh, your employer will see you drinking beer. But I don't think most people are even aware that some of these methods and research is being done. So to sort of to warn people as well.
Right.
No, I think that's true. That a lot of, I mean, it helps to create opportunities also, not only risks, so to speak. Right? Let me ask one question. I would like to give this some attention. So it appears that the aim is to form best working teams. Have you ever considered to apply your research or your approach also to political processes?
Oh, not to political processes necessarily, but in terms of creating best working teams, my understanding is right now we have very limited research on and I know diversity became sort of a dirty word recently, on diversity of personalities, right? Do you want to have two extroverts, two introverts, an extrovert and an introvert on the team? And that's my like dream follow-up paper. And I know exactly the data. I want to link this to sort of PitchBook to try to understand whether different personality makes up of teams cause different productivity gains, etc.
That is awesome. And I hope you present this here once you have it.
I would love to.
Relatively soon, hopefully. I think we need to close. I think we're almost out of time. Marina and Christos, thank you so much for being here. It was not only a pleasure, it was really fun discussing with you guys. And I think there are lots of things that might be follow-on research and application, and hopefully it's also going to find some influence also in practical words, so to speak. Let me just basically, in order to sort of selflessly promoting our next webinar next month, let me briefly put this up, because next month we're going to have Oliver Giesecke from Stanford, who's going to talk a bit more about, again, an asset pricing paper, deep learning for corporate bonds. We're going to disclose very soon who's going to be the discussant. We have him halfway, so let's hope our best. And Marina, Christoph, thank you again. Everybody, thanks for participating. I hope everybody had as much fun as I had, and I look forward to next month. And yeah, hopefully see you soon in 1 month back here on our AI webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you, Christos, and thank you for Paulina and Sasha. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.